in NYC. Join the movement at socialists.nyc.
Comrades, the times are hard. Although DSA is celebrating significant electoral victories and other important gains in our struggle for collective liberation, the road ahead for socialist organizers and people is long and difficult by any measure. On today's episode of Revolutions Per Minute, we're turning to one potential guide to approaching the coming months of struggle: joyful militancy. First outlined in a 2017 book by Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery, and since taken up by activists and scholars with their own interpretations, joyful militancy is the effort of asking and understanding, quote, what makes radical spaces and movements feel transformative and creative, rather than dogmatic, rule-bound, or stifling. Today's episode features urban planner Sabrina Bazile and theater artist Haleh Roshan, both DSA members and organizers, on how they implement the theory and practice of joyful militancy into their work. Good evening, my name is Amy Wilson. I'm your host for today. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with the DSA of North Brooklyn. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute live on WBAI. We are a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the United States, with 70,000 members nationwide. NYC DSA is its biggest chapter. We are run by our 5,500 plus members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. And now, today's headlines with Simone Norman.
In election news, DSA-backed candidates Jabari Brisport, Marcella Mataines, Farah Saffron Forrest, and Zohran Mamdani all won their legislative races. Other socialist and progressive candidates also won their state elections, including Emily Gallagher, Khalil Anderson, and Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. Gotham Gazette covered the sweeping victories of DSA-endorsed and other progressive candidates in last month's primary, which is now confirmed by absentee counts. Vito Bruno, a nightclub owner from Bay Ridge, is planning a serious Republican challenge against State Senator Andrew Gennardis of District 22 in southern Brooklyn this November. Gennardis managed to flip the historically Republican district away from Marty Golden 2 years ago. And in local news, the state legislature reconvened last week and passed several pieces of legislation, including automatic voter registration, a requirement for contractors to pay airport workers the prevailing wage, limitations on legal immunity for nursing homes and hospitals facing malpractice suits, a 2-year moratorium on the use of facial recognition software in schools, and redistricting changes that will likely result in more Democratic districts for the 2022 campaign cycle. Assemblymember Richard Gottfried and State Senator Alessandra Biaggi called on the legislature to pass the Budget Equity Act, which would strengthen the legislature's power over budget negotiations by allowing it to modify appropriations within the budget, as opposed to the current system of being offered all-or-nothing proposals from the governor. 10 progressive and socialist Democrats who are now headed to Albany have also written a public letter to Assembly Speaker Hastie and Senate Majority Leader Stuart Cousins that demands the passage of this bill along with taxing the rich. New York State's emergency rent relief program, which is designed to help a relatively small subset of renters and will give rent voucher money directly to landlords, is under fire for being inaccessible and restrictive. And finally, a federal judge has blocked the release of NYPD police misconduct records following a lawsuit from the city's police union.
Our headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by NYC DSA's Electoral Working Group, covering local politics and radical activism. You can subscribe at thethorn.nyc. And before we get into today's show for Revolutions Per Minute, we just want to send a hearty congratulations and thank you to everybody who worked on DSA's electoral campaigns this cycle. You worked really hard. This victory is yours and ours collectively, and we're really proud at Revolutions Per Minute to be part of the same organization with you. So that's the shout out. And now for today's show. So back in February, which was
organizing.
So to that end, let's talk a little bit about your last appearance on Revolutions Per Minute and how that extends into what we're seeing in the summer of 2020. So that show was Socialist Self-Care. We talked about the radical concept from Black feminist thought of self-care that's often extended as well by organizers to community care. So thinking back to February, feels like a million years ago, but thinking back to February, since that time, we've seen enormous changes in the structure of life, work, and organizing caused by, of course, COVID-19, but as well weeks of active protest in the uprising for Black Lives Matter. So given all of those factors, has your perspective on what self and community care means to organizers changed at all over the last few months? How, why not? If you could just speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think as you laid out, the pandemic has shown that our capitalist systems in place are unraveling. And as racial capitalist systems violently cause housing precarity, evictions, foreclosures, economic precarity, high rates of unemployment, worker alienation, political leaders and people with power using performative gestures and statements in response to Black Lives Matter and racial violence. In all this, I think what's remained unchanged is the need and commitment for liberatory politics, or the need for systems of care and economic justice in response to the failures of the capitalist state in providing material needs. We've seen the institutionalization of mutual aid networks and solidarity economies and other calls for the divestment from racial capitalism and its violence and policing. So I think for me, community care in this time has been even more important as the failures of capitalism is kind of showing its head and leaving people, on their own, destitute, and how as organizers of, liberation and how we can kind of use community care to hold our community, to keep our communities safe and healthy in this time of racial strife, continued racial strife and violence, and the violence of evictions and so forth, and kind of continuing to remain rooted in community. So I still think that the conversations that we had previously on socialist self-care and community care still hold true, even more so.
Absolutely. It was always an anti-capitalist framework and an anti-capitalist and anti-white supremacist ideology, and of self-care and community care is expressed in the words of Black feminists like Audre Lorde. But what we see now, I think, from the turning point of first the pandemic and then in late May, the uprisings and the active protests, is this moment where we're challenged to really put that theory into practice.
Right. And that, and I think what's been interesting and frustrating has been that I think that the way in which abolition has been kind of in the mainstream, I guess, if you want to call it that, has kind of provided that framework or tool in a way to begin to practice what self-care and community care will look like, especially community care, and what it means to think about community in a sense of flourishing a community that's moving, living, that's, thinking about the ways in which capitalism inherently destroys community, thinking about the ways in which, capitalism is exploitative, and thinking about how community through an abolitionist lens is an asset and not a liability.
Absolutely. That puts me in mind of the City Hall encampment, and how after it was cleared forcibly by NYPD, Bill de Blasio justified it by saying it had become just a place for homeless people, as though that meant that it had no political purpose anymore. It had fulfilled its political purpose, or its purpose as a site of protest. But I think organizers, and particularly abolitionist organizers, understand that differently, and understand that a site that providing care can be a form of protest in and of itself.
Right. And not only at City Hall, I'm reminded of, is it Seattle? And yeah, just like the other protests, and the ways in which care has come up and shown in those protests, whether it's, providing food or like there was a video, where they said, like, we're still out here. They don't want to, CNN, Washington Post doesn't want to cover the fact that, we're providing food, we're providing childcare, we're providing PPE, we're providing for the community in ways in which our systems are not.
Mm-hmm. And it highlights the failures of those systems. And in addition to food and childcare, a lot of those spaces were also providing art, music, dancing, performance. And I think that leads very well into the next question that I have for you here, which is that, today's show, we're working around and building on the concept of joyful militancy, which is a book that was written by Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery. So I've got a quote from the book to share. When people come into contact with their own power, with their capacity to participate in something life-giving, they often become more militant. Militancy is a loaded word for some, evoking images of machismo and militarism. For us, militancy means combativeness and a willingness to fight. But fighting might look like a lot of different things. It might mean the struggle against internalized shame and oppression, fierce support for a friend or loved one, the courage to sit with trauma, a quiet act of sabotage, the persistence to recover subjugated traditions, drawing lines in the sand, or simply the willingness to risk. We are intentionally bringing joy and militancy together with the aim of thinking through the connections between fierceness and love, resistance and care, combativeness and nurturance, end quote. So I'll open the space here and give you a chance to respond to the many ideas that are contained in that quote from your perspective as an organizer.
I really connected with the idea of combativeness and willing to fight. I guess as an urban planner, the way I approach my work is through a socialist lens, through a revolutionary lens, I suppose. And that lens is the lens of liberation, and that in and of itself is, I think, joyful militancy within my own work. And so I also connected with the willingness to risk. And I think that's important in the ongoing fight for liberation. The willingness to risk is important for me, especially in my field, my experience as a Black urban planner in the, mainly majority white space. The willingness to risk
my status in a sense, my class, and really organize and fight for the struggles that Black, Indigenous, and people of color face, I think is a piece of joyful militancy. I remember John Lewis when he talked about good trouble, and I suppose I like the idea of like revolutionary trouble, and I connect with the kind of the quiet act of sabotage and kind of the joy and because sometimes it can be scary and hard to be brave, but the joy in kind of being militant and kind of being an agitator, and especially in white supremacist spaces, spaces that I work in, and kind of the continuing struggle and push for what's right, for Black and Indigenous liberation.
What you said really put me in mind of something that another person I interviewed on Revolutions Per Minute said around a year ago in the show that we did about fascism and anti-fascism, where they said, something that inspires them as an anti-fascist organizer is their observation that it's almost always the people with the most to lose who are at the forefront of the struggle, and that they're the people that fight the hardest are often the people who have the most to lose. And I think that's both also rings true in my observation, has a lot of resonances to what you just said, and is an important reminder, for those of us like me who are the beneficiaries of privilege, when we think about what our risk is, to be not afraid to risk, and to remember that, it's a privilege to be able to stay out of the struggle.
Right. Yeah. I think for me as a Black person, I've been, I hate to say the word conditioned, but just, I'm used to the idea of keep fighting. And it can be frustrating when, my other white comrades are, saying like, well, we've been pushing for this for years and nothing's been happening. But it's like, yes, I know that, but it's important that we keep continuing to push, keep centering racial equity and social justice, and keep that as like our stakes of what we're fighting for. And that ultimately is the risk. That's the class suicide or the existential, pain that comes with unlearning white supremacy, capitalist patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. Unlearning it and also living in an environment that is constructed by it.
Right.
Well, thank you very much. These are some very deep concepts, and I think it's hard to put them into words, which is why I personally respond to the book itself, Joyful Militancy. I think it puts a lot of these things that kind of are hard to say and actually says them. So I really appreciate your taking the time to come and speak with me here on today's episode of Revolutions Per Minute. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience?
Just that I think it's important to, as we continue joyfully, militantly, struggling together, I think it's important to keep asking ourselves, like, is what we're doing performative? Is what we're doing actually changing systems is what we're doing, looking at root causes and kind of start asking ourselves, start thinking in those types of lens and frameworks.
Absolutely.
Other than that, yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Amy Wilson. That was Sabrina Bazile, and you're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com. You can find us on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, or on Twitter at NYCRPM. Today, we're talking about joyful militancy. And I will have a live interview with another DSA comrade to round out the second half of the show, so please stay tuned for that. But before we jump into our topic again for the day, I would like to take a moment out of today's show to just remind you about the structure of WBAI and what that means for us at Revolutions Per Minute. So I personally love the freedom that I have as a producer on WBAI to discuss theoretical concepts like joyful militancy and really give voice to the minds and hearts of my comrades, as we say in our introduction to Revolutions Per Minute every week. When I put together a show for Revolutions Per Minute, I don't have to worry about selling something, pleasing or displeasing a corporate sponsor, or properly thanking a memorial foundation for their support. To build this type of radio station environment, however, where free ideas and free thinking can flourish, is not free in and of itself. Our engineers and our staff need a fair wage. We have to pay rent on our station space. We have to pay rent for the transmitter. So donating to the station, whether on a monthly or one-time basis, helps cover those costs, helps keep the station running, and helps make programs like Revolutions Per Minute possible. So I'm not beholden to anybody but you, our listeners, when I make Revolutions Per Minute, and for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if you become a BAI buddy in the name of Revolutions Per Minute, we will give you a shout out, and very soon we'll have sweet merch to give you. But until that time, you might like to consider a WBAI face mask, in the words of our engineer, Reggie, not just an accessory, but a necessity. To give to WBAI, please call 516-620-3602. Once again, that's 516-620-3602. Or you can go to WBAI.org. Thank you so much for listening to WBAI and for your support of the station and for Revolutions Per Minute. And now let's continue on with today's show. So I spent the first half of today's show talking to Sabrina, who is an urban planner and an organizer in a variety of ways, about not only self and community care, but also about joyful militancy and really striking to the root of issues, which is what we might call radicalism. So for the second half of the show, I've got another great comrade. Hopefully they can hear me. Haleh Roshan, are you there?
I am. Hey.
Oh, hello. You're live on WBAI with Revolutions Per Minute.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.
So welcome to the show. If you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us about who you are, what's your connection to DSA, and what's the work that you do as an organizer.
Absolutely. So I'm Haleh Roshan. I'm an organizer with the Uptown Bronx branch of DSA. I sort of helped start that in 2016 and then organized Uptown for a while. Now, honest to be totally candid, I do a lot of sort of independent organizing, but I always try to direct people to the BUM branch. And outside of that, I'm a playwright and I do arts organizing, like sort of talking to theater artists and other sort of multimedia artists, on the liberal political spectrum, and always try to push them towards a more radical politics, towards a more sort of centered political stance in the art that they make.
Great. Well, you can be perfectly candid here on Revolutions Per Minute. You just can't swear.
Great. I'm going to do my best.
Our topic for today is joyful militancy, and I talked about it a little bit with Sabrina. I was able to read a quote from the 2017 book, but before we dive into our conversation, tell me a little bit about your understanding of the concept. How did you learn of it? How would you describe this to someone who is hearing of it for the first time?
I feel like I sort of discovered it myself through my own art practice before I knew that it was a term that other leftists had already considered or thought of. One of those things of feeling the truth of something that I'm trying to do politically, then realizing there's a book already written about it. So the way that I think of it, or the thing that I sort of came to from it, is just that art, I mean, again, I do this through my art, but the thing that I think is the core of joyful militancy is foregrounding in one's politics, no matter how radical they are, a spirit of why we are fighting. And the joyfulness is why we are fighting, right? Like, we are not just fighting to provide sort of basic material sustenance to all humankind, although that, of course, must be dealt with first. Like, we must do that, but we don't just want to survive. The point is not to merely be able to eat and to clothe ourselves and to, have a safe place to live. It's to be able to express ourselves fully as individual, unique human beings in a sort of safe community, collaborative environment, so that we know our needs will be met, and therefore we have the time, the space, the luxury of deciding what we want to say to each other in the world and how we want to do that, whether it's art or whether it's dancing or whether it's science or all of those things together. That for me is my politics of joyful militancy.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I certainly don't want to speak for the authors of the book, but from what I've read of the book and from what I've absorbed of what they have to say, I think they would be very pleased to hear you say that it was a concept that you knew from your life and then found the book that described something that you felt was intuitively and observationally true, because that's also a huge part of the approach of the book, is this kind of this like rhizomatic, like non-hierarchical theory in and of itself. Mm-hmm. Not to get too far down that road on a mainstream program.
That's it, right? And I think that's what's so exciting about the very concept of joyful militancy is like it feels like obvious. Once, like if you have some sort of impulse to, there must be something more to the politics than like owning the means of our production. Like, why? It is to remove capitalism from our interactions, but what does that actually mean? And it means, right, like remembering who we are as fully formed species beings, like that have multiple existences and consciousnesses all at once, and then we should be able to express those in all of our ways. So that's, I love the book. I'm glad that they would also agree that it's a good thing to come to on one's own,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's actually a quote that introduces the book from Audre Lorde, who I was speaking about in the first half of the show, kind of pulling on Black feminist thought and the concepts of self-care. And the quote that they use to frame the book itself is from Audre: "There are no new ideas, there are only new ways of making them felt."
Mm-hmm.
So in the book, Bergman and Montgomery, the authors, make it very clear that joy and happiness are not the same thing. So that might be something that would trip up somebody who is just coming to this concept for the first time. Haleh, what is your understanding of the political use of the word joy in this context?
Joy to me is that thing that it is absolutely not happiness, right? It is that spirit of community, of comradeship, of believing in a future that you cannot possibly see because we are so far from achieving it. And that, in fact, inevitably means a lot of unhappiness, a lot of sadness, a lot of mornings of despair, a lot of like staring down what we know to be the challenges that we have to overcome to become anywhere close to a society that, sort of socialist and across the leftist spectrum know must happen for liberation. That's not happiness at all, like that, but it can be joyful. The joy is remembering that when we succeed, when we actually make the changes that need to be made, when capitalism is no more in our sort of collective consciousness, what is possible? Like anything, absolutely anything. And that to me, like even speaking it, right? If you actually believe that, like the joy that comes from that is much deeper than happiness. For me personally. And that's sort of what I try to work on through my art, or sort of thinking through trying to actually reveal that difference to people, or sort of having an audience or whatever the use of art is to in my opinion, show the difference between what it means to like have faith in each other and in mutual aid and solidarity to work towards something and the joy that comes from that versus happiness, which is like, I mean, it's so co-opted by capitalism and by white supremacy and patriarchy. Like, I don't even know how to describe happiness anymore. So that's the difference for me.
Yeah, and I noticed that even when you responded to the question that I just asked you, you say, you know, when we succeed, when we defeat capitalism, and I think that is so much of the underpinning of the philosophy of like, you know, the hope of an organizer is, you know, not if but when.
Absolutely, hope is praxis, right? Hope is, you know, Maria Makembe, like. Hope is a radical choice that you have to make every single day. It just gets so much easier to make it when you believe that it's sure. Like once you have the practice of hoping every day and suffering the various defeats that look everything like, you know, losing some sort of really brutal street battle to just like recognizing that we haven't even started talking about like debt, you know, global financial capital and what we're supposed to do about that in terms of the revolution. So, you know, like the joy is the belief, and then you can feel like you really might be able to surmount anything because so much needs to be surmounted.
Right, exactly. And something that's interesting about the book itself is that it's kind of a meta theory of organizing. One of the concepts that comes out of the book, Joyful Militancy, is the kind of counterposition with rigid radicalism. So they're not afraid to look at tropes within organizing spaces and kind of toxic patterns that arise even within people who are organizing toward, you know, a future where we're not living under capitalism, and there's no effort to sweep that potential negativity under the rug, which I think is the strength of it. So I would like to talk a little bit about ways in which we bring this theory into practice, because that's what we're all about here on Revolutions Per Minute. And we are broadcasting on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City at 99.5 FM, and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or find us on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, or on Twitter at NYCRPM. I'm Amy Wilson. I'm here live with Haleh Roshan, and we're talking about joyful militancy. So, Haleh, the concept of joyful militancy opens up a lot of doors to, like we've been talking about, to alternative visions of organizing life, making change, creating art. Yet here in the physical world in July of 2020, many of those who make their living in the arts, like yourself, are struggling materially. The extra $600 a week unemployment benefit is going to end this week. We're looking at a wave of evictions in New York City and nationwide. The theater industry, which of course is a major employer here in New York City, is in jeopardy. There's been no formal bailout extended to that industry. And museums and cultural institutions have laid off many of their staff, often those who are already precarious, like part-time workers and contract employees. So let's talk a little bit about the conditions that we're organizing in today. And for you, as an artist and organizer, how do you bring this theory into practice? What are you working toward when you're organizing with joyful militancy?
Yeah, I think something that I am working on literally practically right now is related to, in fact, the sort of problem of there is no bailout for the theater industry, or there is no sort of targeted relief to cultural workers in general, which is obviously unsurprising in the United States of America that doesn't care at all about art or its artists. But even within sort of what we talk about when we talk about the theater industry, or like who is getting bailed out and why, you know, unsurprising surely to you, is there is an entire ecosystem of the theater that previously had no access to that money that we are calling the sort of theater industry money in the first place. And those have always been sort of my people, or the you know, those of us who have always been sort of working outside of what we call industry in order to try to either find some sort of tiny piece of the world of theater goers that we could make our own little sustainable pockets inside of, or, you know, on a sort of larger scale, recognizing that in fact, a lot of what the industry is profoundly white supremacist and will never ever be under capitalism anything close to what they talk about in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion trainings that all of the white liberal theaters love to have. So what I work on really is both reminding those audiences, like the people who are not aware of how sort of profoundly broken the capital I industry is, that is true. And like, who are all of the voices that you're not hearing because of these exact same power structures that are replicated as they are in every other industry under the systems, while also taking and talking to those of us who have been so sort of terrified into like doing our little work as quietly and sort of as closely and insularly as possible, because we know it will be safe and we'll never make any money off of it. We're not making livings off of it, but at least like our 30 friends will come see our show and like, you know, we did our thing, you know? So my work right now is trying to sort of organize all of these people into understanding that both of these things can no longer be true. And they both in different ways replicate the same power dynamics of like inside and outside, like who is included and excluded. What does it mean to like make a profit in an art form that is fundamentally anti-capitalist? It's so interesting how the theater requires live human beings to perform it every single night with a cap of human beings who can consume it every single night. That's not, there is never going to be a capitalist mechanism that like is comfortable inside of that. And that is the strength of theater, right? Now, all of these unemployed artists, what if we were all making street theater every single day? Like, what if we sort of abolished the idea of we need to target market our demographic to like see who's going to come to our show and just say, I have a play and you all are bored and unemployed and we like really don't need anything except people to go make a play. Let's do it in a park. And let's see who like hangs out. Let's see who stops and says, oh, this is a play. That's interesting, you know, and therefore what could we actually change?
Yeah, no, it sounds fantastically exciting. And I'd like to loop back to that at the end of the show if there's any listeners of Revolutions Per Minute who might be interested in getting involved with it, with such an effort or learning more. But there's something in the introduction to Joyful Militancy that the words that you just said made me think of. So I'm gonna read the quote here. This is the quote from Joyful Militancy. So starting now, with so much destruction in motion, this might all sound naive to some readers. Why speak of thriving and love when there are so many massive, urgent problems that need to be confronted? To write about the potential of trust and care at this time in history could seem like grasping optimistically at straws as the world burns. But durable bonds and new complicities are not a reprieve or an escape. They are the very means of undoing empire. We use empire to name the organized destruction under which we live. Through its attempt to render everything profitable and controllable, empire administers a war with other forms of life. The rhythms it imposes are at once absorptive and isolating. Even when this war takes the apparently subtle forms of assimilation and control, it is backed by brutal violence. Prisons and cops lurk alongside discourses of inclusion and tolerance.
I love it. That's it. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and if you do read the book, you'll notice that the authors made the decision to they stick with that use of just the simple word empire throughout the book to kind of name the enemy, which I think is an interesting choice because I do notice here on Revolutions Per Minute and other organizing contexts that I'm in, you get, you know, we try to switch it up. And sometimes I say, you know, white supremacist patriarchy, and sometimes I say patriarchal capitalism, and sometimes we say racial capitalism, which is a term that Ruth Wilson Gilmore and other noted abolitionist organizers have used to great extent. But, you know, in some ways, as an artist, it's simple to kind of symbolify the enemy in that way.
Absolutely. And I think I also really appreciate the word empire, particularly because I think the thing, so even in the arts, but everywhere in American politics, like we still don't think of America as an empire. We are still so stuck including on the left, in conversations that take place within our borders. And I think that is an ending conversation before it's even begun. But that's a different topic.
Well, no, actually, I was going to ask you a follow-up question to that, which is that do you think there's any resonance between theater and sort of an anti-imperialist organizing mindset? I know that's a curveball, but just if you have any thoughts.
I think about it all the time. It's the curveball that's like my home run, you know? Yeah, absolutely. I think the power of theater and the reason that I feel joyfully militant about theater as well. You know, again, a lot of my friends, even comrades on the left who are also sort of involved in theater, are really, really struggling to have some optimism about what theater looks like now. I'm really not, because the only thing that theater should be doing is showing other human beings how human beings live, right? Like, it is literally people in space creating a universe in which human beings move around inside for an audience. That is, I mean, it's storytelling, and there is nothing stronger in terms of linking like people from disparate areas, from people from the same area but disparate backgrounds, existences, you know, the million and billion uniqueness of existences should come out in stories, and that's how we share them. And so for me, like, absolutely, if I can foreground that concept in my theater, like if I can say I'm writing a play where I am speaking to not only my Iranian diaspora family, but also Iranians who are still there, and also my Cuban friends who have never connected a revolution to a revolution, and how those things might be infiltrated and affected by the place where we all now live, which is America. You know, like, that's absolutely a global conversation, and one that I don't know how to tell other than to have human beings enact it for other human beings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what type of response have you gotten as you're organizing in this very pivotal moment for your industry of theater, and you're presenting this sort of radical alternative vision? How are people in your professional life receiving this new information?
Oh, it's wild. I mean, I think people are very interested in that information in a way that they haven't been before. You know, I've been who I am in the theater for a decade, and I have not had a positive response for most of that decade in a way that I'm now sort of being sought out, or like my ideas, I think, are being taken more seriously. But that said, it's also sort of well within the boundaries of the people who were already working outside of the industry. You know, again, the people who understood that the industry was rotten from the beginning. For anybody who is currently in power in the industry is slower, we'll say, to take anything that I might have to say seriously, or even these sort of basic ideas. You know, the kerfuffles around how to respond to the murder of George Floyd by the white theater industry was frankly just embarrassing for anybody who works in theater. And so there still continues to be quite a lot of like conversations that need to be had, even though they've had that conversation every single time a Black person in this country is murdered, and nothing has ever changed, you know?
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of conversation, a lot of hearing, a lot of listening, but not a lot of action that's arisen from it so far. So it's really exciting to hear from people who are presenting an alternative vision and something to work toward. And as we're coming to the end of this week's episode of Revolutions Per Minute, I'd like to kind of bring this part of the interview to a close by asking you, you know, if what's the one thing that you hope somebody listening to this show will take away about the concept of joyful militancy?
I think the one thing is really that it is a practice, you know, but it is also a practice that becomes the politics. Like, it's a beautiful cycle. And so I guess the thing is just keep remembering that there is joy at the other end of what this fight looks like, because this fight sucks. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. I'll try.
I mean, that's like, you know, don't despair, or despair, but remember that like joy is coming. Joy is again, right? Remember the joy always.
Mm-hmm. Or alternatively, despair and actually feel the despair, right? Like, don't shove down the negative emotions and the difficulty that comes with being an organizer and understanding that you're up against this like incredibly powerful force that they call empire and we might call by a variety of different names. You know, don't deaden yourself to those feelings. Let them arise, because they are an authentic response to the situation.
Absolutely. We must be driven by the anger and the sadness and the despair, because like that, there is power in that, even though, you know, capitalism wants you to be pacified all of the time. But again, find the joy in the despair. I think that's really the core of what I mean, is like the despair is there because we know how better it could be. So yeah, balancing those two things, but honoring them both is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and it's really hard work. I certainly wouldn't want to minimize or say that it's easy, but it's very worthwhile, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So thanks so much for being with me today on Revolutions Per Minute. We are coming to the end of our allotted hour. And as we always do, I'd like to give you a chance, Haleh, to talk to the audience about how they can get involved or learn more about what it is that you're doing with your organizing efforts.
I'm to sort of speaking to a bunch of unemployed artists that I want to have making theater in the streets. I'm sort of trying to put together groups of people who would be interested in a very sort of public, maybe perhaps even like directly like protest, direct action sort of arts collective, like theater troupes. So anybody who's interested in that, again, I have a lot of sort of theater industry people that I am working with and talking to about politics and trying to radicalize. But if any actual organizers are out in the world and would be interested in, hanging out and making some weird theater, please, by all means, this should be open to everybody. Everybody has art to make. Everybody who wants to make art should be invited into making art. Absolutely join us.
Great. And how can they do that?
If you can drop my email in the show notes, that would be great. It's just my first name last name at protonmail.com, Haleh.Roshan at protonmail.com.
Perfect. Yeah. And we will absolutely make sure that is in the show notes. And as well, the Joyful Militancy has its own website where many excerpts from it are freely available. So if you listen to the show and you're interested in reading the book, you can always check out revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, and we'll have a link there. Like I said, we're independent community radio here at Revolutions Per Minute, so I am definitely not getting a commission from the authors of Joyful Militancy. I'm just here because I'm interested in the concept. So, Haleh Roshan, thanks so much for coming to speak with me on today's Revolutions Per Minute. It was lovely to have you, and I wish you the best in all your organizing.
Thank you so much. It was fun to talk to you.
Thank you. And to all of you out there, all of our beloved listeners of Revolutions Per Minute, thanks for tuning in. We are coming to the end of today's episode, but we'll be back again next Tuesday at 5 o'clock. And we'll be continuing to talk to organizers in New York City about our continued struggle for working class liberation. So we'll catch you then. I'm Amy Wilson. This has been Revolutions Per Minute. Thanks so much for being with us.